the name of the whole project consortium, and you can see all the members of the consortium here in this slide. So it's quite a large group of higher education institutions as well as networks. And most of our colleagues are present in the conference today and will give you some input into the work of the project. On technical issue, I would ask you all to switch off your microphones. You might have the opportunity later on in the discussion to maybe activate it again. But for our purposes, it would be helpful if you all, except of the speakers, of course, can turn off your microphones. Thank you. So we're very happy to have the opportunity to present you some of the contents and some of the activities we've been working on in the project. I have the agenda here. I think it might be a bit difficult to see. You can, if you don't know this platform, Big Blue Button, you can maximize the presentation if you use the icon at the lower right corner of the presentation. And we have the agenda for the whole program today in the shared notes, and you can find them, you can open them in the left column. So if you want to have a look at what we are planning with you today or this morning, then you can just have a look at the shared notes as well. First of all, of course, we will introduce quickly the project, the general idea of what we've been intending to do with the project. And then we're very happy to have a colleague, a member of the Erasmus Student Network with us to include the student's perspective on what quality student mobility is and what the goal of our activities should be to actually cater for the students' needs. Afterwards, we will have colleagues from the University of Versailles and the University of Barcelona who will present the outcomes of the first project activities to identify structural barriers to mobility and offer you some of the results we have drafted from the activities in the first phase of the project. And after a short coffee break, one of the major outcomes of the project, the Curricula matching tool or the piloting phase of this tool, will be presented to you. And the colleague from the European University Foundation, Thiago, will give you an insight into what this tool is about and what the usability for you at the higher education institutions will be. In the end, we will have a panel discussion, which will give you the opportunity to get into the discourse on what quality student mobility should be and what the goals of our mobility projects should be to have successful internationalization in our institutions. So this is a bit of the overall program that we have today, and we would start with the introduction. I have to switch the slide, the introduction to the NORM project, to give you a quick input into what the major ideas of this project will be or are. And the starting point of the project was, of course, the status quo of student mobility. In the European higher education area, as you all might know, we have defined targets of what student mobility should be and what quality criteria it should follow, as well as quantitative goals, targets that are set on central level. And one example is the 20% target of graduate students that have spent at least 3 months studying or training abroad, or at least achieving a minimum of 15 ECTS abroad during their studies. And this is one of the targets set within the European higher education area. And this is one of the targets, because most of the countries have not achieved as of now. It was set for 2020, 2021, and most of us are quite far away from this goal still. And this was one discussion, including both the quantity aspect, how can we increase the number of students going abroad, having the opportunity to go abroad during their studies, as well as the quality to have successful student mobilities. And both these aspects were relevant for us in our discussions, and this is why we decided to start the project in 2019. So quite a while back by now, and this was a core idea really. Another aspect back in 2019 was of course that we got first glimpses of what the new Erasmus Plus program would be, what priorities, what standards there might come up in the new program generation, starting or by now having started in 2021. And we wanted to ensure that higher education institutions would be prepared or would be ready to actually implement the new Erasmus Plus program, to follow the standards of the new Erasmus Charter. Of course, back then we didn't know the details, but we all knew that there would be some changes and that, of course, the goals and the criteria would be reconfirmed and even maybe the standards set higher. So we knew that there should be something happening to support higher education institutions, as well as, of course, our major target group, the students. So this was the starting point, and then we tried to design different approaches to understand why students are not as mobile as we would want them to, and why many student mobilities, even if they do take place, maybe do not achieve that level of quality or that level of success as concerns, for example, ECTS, recognition of the activities taken abroad, and to understand why this is happening and how we could actually maybe tackle some of the problems. And one very important aspect here is that we wanted to focus on structural and systemic barriers. So not on the individual barriers. We know a lot we have done, or there has been a lot of research done on barriers to mobility from student perspective as well as from institutional perspective. And we know, and the colleagues in a moment will present you some more details on that as well. We know that there's a number of barriers, and some are more personal, more individual, and some are more overarching barriers. And we, in the project, we wanted to focus on the structural barriers that can be dealt with, that can be approached from an institutional level, or maybe even from a national level. And on the other hand, we decided that it might come handy to develop some kind of tool, some kind of support tool to help students and institutions to actually identify potential positive mobility opportunities, to identify partner institutions that could ensure successful student mobility. So these are the two core elements of the project that you will learn more about today. And just to give you a quick overview of these two columns, these two central pillars of the project, I have added here two more slides to give you a bit more detail. So the structural and systemic barriers to mobility. We already identified some access points where we could start identifying details of how these barriers are built into the institutional or educational systems. And one element is, of course, for example, curricula design. So if mobility options are integrated into the curricula, if there's sufficient electives available for students to choose to take for their mobility period abroad, or recognition procedures, recognition regulations at the institution, and of course national regulations for recognition. And a third element that I want to mention here is accreditation of degree programs, how far internationalization, student mobility is considered in the accreditation process of study programs, for example. or re-accreditation. A number of institutions have a new process where they now feed these elements into the further development of degree programs. So these were aspects that we started our research on, and of course related to this, and this is something that you will of course face always in your daily work as maybe mobility managers, project managers, in Erasmus or other mobility programs, the partnership management, how this influences the successful mobility, and on the other hand, what is needed to remove barriers by, for example, having successful partnership management. Information management, access to information, often this is seen a bit as an individual barrier, maybe if students can find information to ensure successful mobility, but at the same time, this is a bit of a structural, institutional responsibility as well, of course, and a program responsibility. If you see the next bullet point on my list, the digitalization, especially in the Erasmus Plus program, of course, this is an element that can build barriers to mobility, but maybe it can remove barriers as well and smoothen the process for students and for institutions. For this pillar of the project, the major outcome that is foreseen at the end of the project will be a European curricula design guide to help institutions design like mobility-friendly, mobility-open curricula in their degree programs to ensure successful student mobility. The other aspect I already mentioned was the curricula matching tool that the colleague from the UF will present later on. And a starting point here to decide why this could be helpful was, again, this aspect of information, access to information that I mentioned earlier. And here you can see the link between the structural approach and the finding a way to pave the way to mobility, because the tool could offer a chance to enable easy, reliable access to information, to course information for students and staff. And it could offer an easy way to find equivalences for successful recognition processes. And of course, the tool fits into the overall process of digitalization that we face, especially in Erasmus. And so one aspect is it fits into the overall scheme, and the other, the European Student Card Initiative, the EWP network, will offer access to a number of relevant data that can be used in the context of course matching, curricula matching for successful recognition. So this was just to give you already a bit of an idea of what we will be talking about and what the major targets of the project are. And the colleagues will be much more informed and will be able to give you much more detail on the relevant activities and results. Just a quick summary, you noticed it is, of course, in my presentation already. So we have, as target groups, as stakeholders in this whole project, of course, the students as the major beneficiaries of the mobility activities. On the other hand, the higher education institutions. So in a way, I presume most of you will be from the international offices or maybe from faculties. So you and your institutions are the second major target group of our project activities. And the third group that we want to mention is the policymakers, because if we talk about systemic barriers, this is something that often cannot be dealt with only on institutional level, but some of the barriers are on a different level or in a different context. So we might address barriers that are more in a national context or even in a European context. So these are the three major lines of communication we try to implement in the project and to address these different interests of the groups I mentioned. So I hope I have been able to give you a bit of an idea of what to expect and what we've been working on. I want to add that some of the activities We started in 2019. Of course, we all know what happened in 2020. So some of the activities were a bit hindered. So we had to change a bit the order of things in the project. And I guess you all know what this meant for some of the projects. So don't wonder if some of the details are, we worked a lot with, of course, virtual activities, virtual mobilities, and this might have changed some of the data. And it will be interesting, maybe in the feedback round later on, to get your experience on this, or on how this might have changed the topic that we are discussing today. But now, hand over to Juan. And thank you so much for joining us today, Juan. I think you can introduce yourself, the ESN network, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Christina. I don't know if you can hear me well. Fantastic, perfect. I assume that I can just move the slides like this. Okay, it says that I have 11 slides, but I have a bit more. I don't know if it will change later. Okay, perfect. Thanks a lot. Thanks. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in this fantastic conference. This is a very nice project that we are super happy to participate in the Erasmus Student Network. The Erasmus Student Network, just as a super fast introduction, is the biggest European and basically international network of Erasmus students and alumni, with more than 540 sections all over Europe, present in more than 1,000 higher education institutions, and in 42 countries of the European higher education area at the moment. So basically, this is a fundamental topic for us: access to mobility, barriers to mobility. As Christina said, we have been involved in many different projects and initiatives, mapping out challenges, problems, different situations that make access to mobility more difficult, and also the other way around, in different solutions to try to make mobility more accessible for as many people as possible. But now with this presentation, I'm going to try to do two things. First, I'm going to talk a bit about our perspective when it comes to the barriers. I will try a different approach to one of the projects so we can kind of complement both approaches. Of course, in some aspects, it will overlap a bit, but I think that's positive because I had a chance to go through the desk research, which is a fascinating document, by the way. And I think it's interesting to highlight some things. And then I will move to our proposals, some ideas from the Erasmus Student Network that can easily complement the results of the project. So let's start. First of all, data and numbers. A bit of the data. You can see here basically the latest numbers when it comes to participation in the Erasmus Plus program. The year 2018, last year, for which we have final data, 351,000 students participated in either study mobilities or trainship mobilities, both around Europe through KIO 103 and around the world through KIO 107. So these numbers are indeed good. They show that we are experimenting a gradual but slow increase. But just as Christina pointed out before, we are very far away from our targets. You can see here all the data from the Education and Training Monitor. You can see that basically very few countries, especially leaving aside the very small countries like Luxembourg or Cyprus, actually achieve the 20% target. But beyond looking at the overall numbers, what I believe is very interesting is to look at national differences, for instance, and how countries like Finland, countries like Germany have way higher numbers than other countries, like South European countries, for instance, Spain, Italy, and so on. And if we go into the data a bit more, we can see a very interesting thing. And we can see and that is a correlation between having a more diversified offer of mobilities and just relying on the Erasmus program and European programs in general. So basically, countries like the Netherlands, like France, like Denmark, that have a more diversified offer, actually send more people abroad. And this is applicable mainly for credit mobility and also for, of course, degree mobility, but that's another topic. So then we have to ask ourselves, why? Is it because Erasmus doesn't provide enough options? Is it because when we combine different mobility opportunities, that's more interesting to the students? Indeed, a lot of questions to be asked and a lot of reflections to be made, but just for you to keep in mind about this. Then, moving to the barriers. When we analyze both our own data from ESN surveys or other projects like CM that I will tell you more about a bit later on, and both big studies like the Erasmus Impact Study, we can basically differentiate between three types of barriers: personal, financial, and academic, and say academic/information. So these barriers are present across the board. Wherever we look, we keep on finding them. Indeed, these two are the most important ones, personal and financial, and very important, these barriers are connected most of the time. So we cannot isolate them. It's very likely that once the person reports some kind of personal barrier, that's also connected to a financial barrier. It can be the case of students from disadvantaged backgrounds who struggle to go abroad because of financial difficulties, but also because personal difficulties, because they need to take care of their families and so on. Another very interesting thing is that these barriers are perceived very differently by mobile and non-mobile students. So if we ask a student who actually went abroad, which were the biggest barriers that person encountered to take the decision and to then go on mobility, they will tell us financial barriers were the most complicated part of all. But if we ask a non-mobile student, why did he not go abroad? He will tell us that personal barriers, personal and familiar barriers are the most important ones. So once again, something to think about. And just looking a bit more in depth to all the different barriers that students report, this data comes from the Erasmus Impact Study 2019. And once again, family reasons or personal relationship, just like we said before, and a lot of aspects related to financial barriers. These two are a bit more normal and mainstream. I think it's also very, very interesting to think about the part of information barriers. We live in the age of social media. Most universities now have social media channels. All universities have web pages. We do a lot of events to promote mobility, but still students keep on saying that information remains a barrier. Why is that? What are we doing wrong? And more importantly, what can we do differently? From our latest research from the CM project, we also differentiated between three different types of barriers that will allow us to then come up with proposals adjusted to each of the barriers. First, institutional, so barriers that reflect the programs that are being offered and the regulations that coincide with these programs that may impact the access of specific student groups to mobility opportunities. Environmental, basically environmental and societal factors that influence the person's decision to take part in mobility. And here, access to information is super important. And attitudinal barriers that tackle the belief system and emotions around the topic of mobility opportunities to see how they influence their participation rates. So basically, internalized barriers. In our latest research, and for this research, we managed to gather more than 12,000 responses. We once again saw these differences between the opinions of mobile participants and non-mobile participants. So for mobile participants, a very clear concern was the fact that they had to basically advance initial costs. Students get to their Erasmus destination, they have to spend a lot of money, new apartment, getting used to the city, buying stuff for the house, and most of them do not receive the Erasmus Plus grant till some months later. And a very big number, 82% report that this is a big practical barrier for the state, especially for a quality state. And then, if we continue seeing, there are several other which are related to financial aspects. Then, once again, we move to students who did not go abroad, and we see differences. We see how, first of all, funding remains a very big challenge, but other topics like lack of flexibility, concerns about impact on the academic achievement, lack of knowledge, personal reasons are way more prevalent, showing that those personal elements that are so much connected to information, motivation, are a big factor, a big pull factor that makes people not to go abroad. Then, a bit more in depth when it comes to financing support. Basically, students report almost always cost of living that goes above the Erasmus Plus grant. This poses a very big challenge for students, and actually the majority of them from our research say that their grants didn't cover all their expenses and not even the majority of it. So basically that they had to put their own money, that they had to look for sources of funding, that they had to ask support from their parents, which doesn't really permit the students to enjoy the experience in depth, since they have to be very worried about where to get the money from. Now, the final part, when it comes to the barriers, the challenges that regulated professions face. This is more tackled in the research, but we have been working on the topic for the last years, trying to partner up with associations, especially from the medical sector, but we're trying to get together with different associations working with specific study fields, and we see that there are big differences in terms of participation. We all know that, but of course, in the times where we're living, it's very important that all types of students can benefit from mobility. So these disparities should be tackled, should be explored in depth to come up with solutions. And now, the way forward, some thought-provoking proposals from our side, ideas from the Erasmus generation that we believe can help to make mobility the norm. The first one, a lifelong approach to learning mobility. We have seen how many factors that make students not to go abroad, that actually act as a barrier for students, are related to personal beliefs, to personal ideas, to perceptions. So it's not only about the money, there are more factors. Therefore, we believe that to tackle this, promotion from an early age that helps to make mobility a normal part of the educational experience can be very helpful. And for that, we need to go to the schools. We cannot tackle this problem from the higher education sector alone. It's impossible. In ESN, we have several programs like Erasmus in schools that try to tackle this directly, going to the schools with students, with international students, to create these intercultural learning environments and to talk about why mobility is so beneficial, how you can start considering mobility from an early age, how you can benefit from mobility opportunities. Because also from our own research, we know that mobility increases mobility. If students go abroad once from an early age already, they are way more likely to participate in another mobility later, somewhere down the road, when they are doing their bachelor's, doing their master's, and so on. And for that, indeed, we need collaborations. We need cross-sectoral collaborations. I believe that European university networks provide the perfect space to do this. Collaborations between higher education institutions, student associations, local municipalities, regional governments, coming up with programs that can help the pupils, that can also be very beneficial for the international students. Then, creating a culture of mobility through internationalizations. So also, from previous research, we know that universities with a mobility culture are more likely to send people abroad. So how can we create a mobility culture in a university? We believe that internationalization at home plays a key role here. So whole institution approaches that involve students and staff, and that consider all the possibilities that international students bring. So international students are an immense capital in our universities. There are so many ways that local communities and the student population in general can benefit from them. But of course, this is not going to happen just out of nowhere. We need to come up with concrete ideas, with programs, with initiatives like, for instance, connect international students with future outgoing students from our universities to foster intercultural learning, to solve doubts. Some universities for instance, in Spain, do this in collaboration with our local association or with other student organizations, and the results are very positive. And in general, in any international strategy, should consider different measures to foster interaction between international students and the student population at large. It can be now, of course, with virtual learning, it's also good because this can help to internationalize the whole higher education institution and to convince people to go on a mobility. But in general, our vision for ESN is that a strategic peer-to-peer communication with institutional support is the best way to approach that targeted promotion. So you can do campaigns, you can do just general activities, but if you use the students, if you collaborate with the students to reach other students, it's going to be much more effective. Then better national and local grants to complement Erasmus. We have an Erasmus Plus program, is very positive. We have achieved so many things, and all of us should be very happy for these improvements, but we should indeed strive for more. And we should do this considering the distribution of competences. So the European Union in the field of education can only do so much, especially in a moment in which it's so hard to get more budget for the MFF. It's so hard to convince national governments to increase their contributions. But what we can do using our advocacy power as universities, as student networks, is to get to our representatives, local, regional, and indeed national, to ask for more support to the Erasmus Plus program. The Erasmus Plus program is a program that is supposed to be co-funded, and therefore more effort should be made to increase co-funding. I believe this can be very positive also for regions, for cities, because this will help them to gain more visibility. This will convince them to increase their promotion that they do about the Erasmus Plus program, and to have also this sense of ownership of the program, which can be very positive because it can make it more recognized and well known in our communities. And then simplification, transparency, and flexibility, coming up with the topic of paying grants up front. So in the field of public policy, in general, we see how we're talking more and more about less ex-ante controls and more ex-post controls. So if we're talking about this kind of flexibilization measures in fields related to public policy, economics, and so on, let's move them as well to the Erasmus Plus program, right? Let's look for more simple ways to give the grants, because to be honest, I think that the risks of not doing it, the risks of having this bureaucracy, just believing that students might try to take the money and not go abroad, actually overweight the benefits. It's much better to trust the students and to look for ways to then get the money back if some students do not do it. But this trust, these more simple procedures can really help the students to take the decision and also to increase the quality of their experiences. Same for transparency. Right now, a student basically cannot know which are the grants that friends from other countries get, that even friends from other universities in the same country get. So we advocate for transparency, and this is very easy. We need single entry portals so any student anywhere in Europe can check the different grants that different countries, regions, and even universities have. That can be a very good measure to foster mobility across the board as well. And it's perfectly doable, especially now that we are working so much in the field of digitalization. Almost done. When it comes to variety of mobility formats and destinations, now in the new Erasmus program, we also have new blended formats, super positive, very good. We in ESM believe that they're especially positive as a way to introduce students into mobility and to foster internationalization. So just having a student participating in a mobility of 1 week should never be the final goal. The goal should always be to, whenever possible, strive for long-term mobility. We know it's more impactful. We know it's better for language learning, competence development, and so on. So let's use this tool to promote long-term mobility. And of course, let's continue exploring more innovative and new formats, both under the umbrella of the Erasmus Plus program, but also other types of collaborations using existing networks and existing cooperations. And when it comes to the international dimension of the Erasmus Plus program, we see that countries like the Netherlands, like Finland, like Germany, that have more international opportunities, just besides the Erasmus Plus program, manage to send more people abroad. So this means that if we continue increasing the international dimension of Erasmus Plus program, we are probably going to be more likely to reach out to other types of students who might not be interested to go somewhere in Europe, but who might want to go somewhere else. This is very positive from many different points of view. So let's continue exploring it. And last, outline academic attainment. Provide information on how the mobility program will contribute to the student's academic progress, and if a specific academic threshold is requirement of a mobility program, ensure that this is balanced with other criteria. In order to convince students, especially in fields where people are more worried about their academic attainment and academic achievement in general, we should do an exercise to try to convince students on the many benefits that mobility brings, also in academic and competence development terms. And that's all from my side. Thanks a lot, and I'm completely open for any question that you might have.
Thank you very much, Juan. I think it was a very inspiring and helpful presentation, and I think especially seeing the links, the individual barriers that you have been presenting and that are of course popping up in all the surveys, like the financial and personal barriers to mobility, and how this is interlinked still with the more structural barriers. So I think you really built the bridge between these two perspectives, showing that it's not to be seen separate from each other. And I think with the next part of our agenda, we will learn more about, because we will have the presentation on the identification of structural barriers based on the research done in the project. And I think we will recognize a number of aspects that we've been mentioning now. And so later on, there will be time for you, for participants, to ask questions. If there is any questions, you can, of course, already post them in the chat, and we will try to get back to this later on. But now let me introduce and welcome the colleagues from the University of Versailles, Jan Bon, and from the University of Barcelona, Ramon Munoz. I think, Jan, you will start with your part on the desk research, if I understand correctly. So thank you, and I'll give the floor to you.
Okay, hello, Christina. I hope the sound is okay. My connection is a bit tricky this morning. I might have to switch off the picture at some point if it's not working well. So, well, thank you to Juan for a very comprehensive approach. It's excellent to start off with a student's point of view, because Erasmus is very largely about making students move, even though staff mobility is also, of course, an issue. Can I move the slides myself, or? Yes, I can do that, apparently. Okay, thank you. Here is just a quick view of the contents of the desk research. So we had to provide a fairly comprehensive report on what has been written about kind of structured mobility in the European higher education area, and we also organized an internal survey amongst consortium partners to identify barriers and to discuss possible solutions. It is important to stress once again that this was done, that the project was conceived before COVID-19, and that COVID-19 obviously changed a certain number of things, but not everything. Here are the different chapters. I don't think I need to read it out, and we can move on to the next slide. So we had a glossary in the report because we felt the need to define a certain number of terms. So having heard just before some expressions, we insisted on using the term blended mobility when we were talking about a combination of what you can see at the bottom of the list, an international distance learning experience, which is what most of us have been involved in the past year or so, and actual physical mobility. That is to say, we tried our best to avoid the term virtual mobility because it is problematic for a number of reasons. The main reason being that some might think that a virtual mobility can simply replace a physical mobility, and we all felt that this is absolutely not the case. And we've just heard from Juan how important it is to actually go to a place. It takes time to get used to a place, and it's very much part of the experience, of course. So blended mobility, credit mobility is another theme. That is to say, mobility that allows students to validate credits, ECTS credits. Degree mobility is a more structured form, of course. Double degree programs are very structured and include mobilities. And another term, another aspect that was important to look into was the duration, even though this is not strictly speaking the scope of this project, but we do need to be aware of the fact that we have different lengths of mobility, and that the appreciation of such an experience may vary according to the length of the stay. We noticed, for instance, that structured short-term mobilities are actually an institutional possibility in Central Europe, where you have dedicated funds between partner countries to organize short trips abroad. In other European countries, this is more complicated to organize, and we don't have a kind of equivalence of that. There is also the question of free movers that one shouldn't forget, that mobility is also very much to be looked at. Free movers who decide to go to another country, to another university, and so forth. Okay, that's as far as the glossary is concerned. Now, let me do this in the English way and come out with the main findings straight away. In the executive summary, we put the principal findings of this report. So the level of funding is of course an important issue. Juan mentioned it, and it is true from what we saw also that students tend to continue to identify insufficient funding as the principal obstacle to mobility. I think it is worth pointing out also that we have, of course, a different cost of living in different European countries, and to organize mobility to Central or Eastern Europe is a different challenge compared to going to Norway or Sweden or other places. So in any case, most of us here today probably know about the Erasmus Plus 500 initiative. It cannot be said often enough that the funding is indeed a big obstacle. Personal reasons are also another obstacle, and this is maybe more difficult to deal with because they vary, but some of them can possibly be dealt with, at least to some extent, as far as the problems of workload and recognition are concerned. I agree that European University Alliances are a very good initiative to enhance mobility, but speaking about the experience of the one that my university is associated to, or UGLO, piloted by the University of Paris-Saclay, let me just put it this way: automatic recognition of credits from partner universities is not as obvious as it might seem to be. So we have had cases where it was not sufficient to say that somebody had done something in a partner university, I think they're elaborating certificates right now. Anyway, the personal reasons are definitely a main concern. And then the third principal finding was the fact that blended mobility seemed to be a good way, a useful way, an efficient way to some extent to foster physical mobilities. Okay, if we look at this in a little bit more detail, we identified the need for more incentives to motivate increasing numbers of students. And our idea was that these so-called international distance learning experiences are a good way to foster interest. So in another project, I organized a seminar this year with a colleague from Marburg and a colleague from Porto University, and we thought that this might be a good way to convince students of the interest of actually going to one of the partner universities. So there should be more incentives to organize short programs, such as intensive training programs. Of course, we have the KA2 actions, which are a good way of organizing this, but I think universities could also reflect on other ways of organizing short programs or funding short programs, as they are clearly pull factors. Now, then we move to a more structured form, which are joint and double degree programs with a mandatory mobility. This is, of course, ideal, and it is important to insist on the fact that from what I read, from what we found out from partners and students and research, it is clear that a double degree adds value in terms of your career perspective, and that's something that one should, of course, stress also in communication campaigns. And then, thirdly, this is partly based on personal experience. I consider myself to be quite mobile, going almost every year on an Erasmus Plus mobility, but we definitely need more incentives, especially in terms of recognition of personal involvement to develop mobility schemes. We all know the importance of staff implication in making mobility work. So we need more incentives, and to speak once more about the European University Alliance initiative, I think this is one of the problems we have, that so far there is no formal recognition, at least in my institution, of your involvement in such projects. So this is something that one needs to reflect on. Okay, the impact of COVID, I think we need to have just a quick remark about this. We are all going through the experience still now, so it is obvious that this crisis has impacted our ways of organizing mobilities. And I think it is also obvious that we are probably not going to return to the situation we had before. There are discussions in France right now to actually make it structurally possible, institutionally possible, to continue to use distance learning as a tool. So this is something that we need to think about. In any case, distance learning will no doubt lend arguments to those that a mixed strategy of distance learning experience in an international context and a physical mobility to a foreign destination might be an efficient tool to develop mobility flows. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. In the second part of the report, we discussed the results from a survey we organized amongst the partners. And the general result was that there are some study areas in which it is more difficult or almost impossible to organize mobilities, and they concern notably health studies, law, teacher training, and theology, which tend to be the least mobile subject areas. I allowed myself to add, however, that law at our university seems to be an exception to the rule, because from our figures, it is clear that law is the most mobile faculty at UVSQ. Now, don't believe that UVSQ is not mobile at all if the law faculty is the most mobile faculty. In fact, we have a very strong international relations program inside the law faculty, and the students in the specializing in this field during their bachelor studies of law in the third year tend to go abroad, and it is actually intended to make the whole group go abroad as part of the mandatory mobility experience. That's more than 50 students every year. So this explains why UVSQ is very mobile. And then, of course, at master's level, we also have a number of international programs in law, and students continue to go abroad. So it is an exception, apparently, to the rule. Apart from that, health studies tend to be difficult. We have different systems. For instance, between France and Germany, it is not easy at all to organize exchange programs in health. I don't say it's impossible, it's not easy at all. And if I think of our own medical school, for instance, the answer we usually get is that the best moment to go on a mobility is in the 6th, which is fairly late in the day, isn't it? Okay. Most partners mentioned the fact that in professional programs or programs leading up to a specific profession, like medical professions or law professions, etc., there is a national framework that you have to respect, and that makes mobilities very difficult, if not impossible. So I confirm for the French case, for instance, that in teacher training, it is not easy at all to organize a mobility during the preparation for the school teacher exam, because they have a lot of activities. And this is probably the case in most countries. Now, some conclusions from the survey and recommendations. So the question of mobility at master's level needs some particular focus. So at least in our experience in France and at UVSQ in particular, most mobilities are organized at the bachelor level. So even though we have countless possibilities of sending students abroad at master's level, This is a tricky question. Well, it is true that the teaching load is fairly heavy in master programs in France, and there's always the feeling that if the students are not following all the classes, they're not going to get what they need to validate their degree. So this needs reflection, of course, and embedded mobility would be an excellent way of doing that. The number of double degrees apparently remains relatively low in each of the partners of the NORM project now, mostly below 10. So I don't know if our partners in NORM are an exception to the rule, or if this reflects practice in general across the European higher education area. But for any of you involved in having set up a double degree, you know how much work it is, and it is not obvious to motivate colleagues to get involved in this. So we need incentives here as well. We need, of course, to distinguish between incoming and outgoing mobility, as well as embedded mobility and free movers when we're analyzing these questions. And then what we found out, and I think our colleagues from Barcelona will say more about that, that the most common international programs tend to be in computer science, economics, and business studies, because of English as a lingua franca, I suppose, and then tourism and international relations. Here are some more remarks. I don't know if I have time to read out all of this. One remark, it is not always easy to find out the appropriate moment for mobility. So at our university, for instance, we tend to encourage students to go on a mobility in the 5th or 6th semester, preferably the 5th, because in the 6th you will have your end of term exams for the degree, but we tend not to encourage students to leave in the 1st and the 2nd year. So we might have to reflect on that a little bit more. It is also true that colleagues do not always play the game fully in not easily accepting the courses that students want to take in other universities, and this might be an obstacle. And then at master's level, the fact that you have to prepare a master's thesis is often also seen as an obstacle to abroad. Okay, what initiatives could HEIs take? So there could be incentives like specific dedicated funds to develop educational projects, including European university and alliances. Dynamics can be created, of course, by developing your participation in Erasmus Plus KA2 actions, notably, because it opens up new possibilities of exchange, and it opens in particular up new budgetary options, so that you dispose of funds at the international office to provide incentives. Once again, there is the sensitive issue of the recognition of staff members' contribution to such projects. And then one needs to think about the time that you spend on these activities. Personally, I feel that when we talk about innovation in pedagogical or didactic terms, developing mobility activities could be included in such programs. And at our university, for instance, we do have dedicated funds to the issue of innovation. So perhaps this is a way of doing it in some institutions. And I think that's almost it. I wanted to end on with student perspectives. So once again, the financial aspect, in conclusion, is a principal concern for many students. It is interesting to note that amongst non-mobile students, many indicate that a mandatory mobility would have indeed forced them to go on a mobility. So this can be considered to be a good thing, because they did not say that there shouldn't be mandatory mobilities. So they might need some encouragement. And then another point that is important, I think, is the fact that mobilities contribute in a very important way to interest in and identification with European identity. We know that the European Commission is aware of that, and they put it in different calls always: to what extent does your project contribute to this important issue? But mobility is, of course, a very, very important aspect. The career perspectives of mobility experiences should be insisted on and systematically included in communication about mobility experiences, because it is definitely a plus, as everyone agrees, but some people still need to be convinced of that. And then in conclusion, blended mobility is likely to prove an efficient way to increase physical mobility flows. And I think that's about it, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. And my apologies that you had to rush a bit through the last slides, especially as I think the recommendations, the conclusions that you presented were very helpful indeed, based on the data you have assembled in your desk research. This really leads directly to Ramon and the presentation of the surveys for students and staff that the University of Barcelona was responsible for in the project. So, Ramon, I would give the floor directly to you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank everybody for attending this conference that I believe is going to be very useful for promoting international mobility among students. So let me present one part of the project which is connected with surveys. Okay, so our aim was to provide evidence through the perceptions of both students and staff on academic and institutional, let's say, structural barriers to international student mobility. Okay, so and this was together with what Jan has been presenting, a way to inform other parts of this project, in particular intellectual output 3, which is the next part of the project, and then subsequent intellectual outputs. So in order to provide evidence through perceptions, the way to do it was through the elaboration and launching of 2 different surveys in order to capture both students and staff perceptions on barriers to international students' mobility. Okay, so and these 2 surveys complement and qualify each other and could also provide further evidence on what Juan has been presenting in the first part of these conferences. So we elaborated a 27 question survey for students that was launched in 2 different rounds, and we obtained more than 2,600 responses, which is, we believe, a good number. And also we launched a 29 question survey for staff. This was made in a single round. And in the process of distribution and dissemination of these surveys, consumption patterns had a crucial role in the sense that these surveys were distributed at university level, and they were also posted through social media. This was especially made by Erasmus Student Network, so parents were playing an important role. Okay, so which were the results that we obtained? So first of all, take into account that the results to some extent can be a little bit biased because of we have an unequal distribution when we look at countries, when we look by universities, and even when we look by gender. For instance, there are 3 countries that account most of the answers we received, and also there are universities that are overrepresented in our answers, and that means that the results that we provide, I think that they are strong, but of course you have to take into account that they are unequally distributed. Okay, so I think that's important to take into account. Okay, good. So how is going to organize this presentation? Okay. So we are going to organize this presentation around 4 main contents. I believe that they are key contents. One is to place what is the main objective of this project. That means to identify academic institutional barriers in a broader perspective. Okay, in the line that Juan has been doing at the beginning, of this meeting. Then I will move to look at the perceived most relevant academic and structural barriers to international student mobility. Third, we will look more in depth about the determinants of some of these perceived more relevant academic and structural barriers, and in particular, I would like to provide some information on studies prolongation, which is one of the main worries by students when, but non-mobile students mainly, when they are asked about their preferences in terms of mobility. And also, another important point is about credit recognition. And finally, the last evidence, or the last set of evidence that we will provide, will be connected to the area of study fields. So the point is whether there are differences in academic barriers when we look at different study fields. Okay, so let's start by looking at the first point. So trying to place institutional and academic barriers in a broader perspective. So we were asking, okay, the reasons why students, and in this case, non-mobile students, decided not to be on mobility or not planning a mobility. And the same answer was for staff members, okay, for staff. And what is interesting is how similarities prevail, okay? And the point in both cases is that income constraints come first. It was the main reason that is considered as a barrier to international mobility. Okay, but, and I think that that's the point, academic and what we call institutional or structural barriers are also perceived as very important. Okay, if you look at this figure, you can see that this is the second most important barrier. And also connected to structural barriers, we find that elements associated with poor mobility managing, or elements connected to uncertainty on academic formation are also important, mainly for students. Okay, so structural barriers are also relevant. Okay? So sometimes this is placed in third position when we look at the different determinants of mobility, but you can see that has an important role. And of course, perceptions are different depending if you are a non-mobile student or if you are from if you are a staff member. Okay, so according to staff members, language barriers is also important to understand why not more students are mobile students, whereas this is not so important for students. And on the other hand, when you look at academic formation, students consider that this is another important point, whereas staff members believe that this is not so important as students believe. Okay, so in a broader perspective, what we have is that academic barriers and institutional barriers are really relevant. Okay, income constraints come first, but then we have this kind of barriers. But what are the most relevant academic and structural barriers to international students' mobility? So we asked two different options, and each of the options had to be graded from 0 to 10. And the results that we obtained are the following. Okay, so and here in this slide that you can see, we are comparing students' responses and staff responses. And there are important similarities. The most, or the perceived most important structural barrier was that, according to students, that mobility abroad can prolong studies at the home university. And the same is considered by staff members when we are assessing students' mobility. Okay, staff members add another element: the lack of study programs in English as at the partner institution as another important barrier. This is not so clear in the case of students. Okay, so together with the possibility that mobility abroad can prolong studies at the home university, there are other relevant factors, like difficulties in credit recognition is the second most important element. And then complex procedures to apply for mobility, another reason that is given by students, uncertainty or lack of information on courses and syllabus at the host institution, another point. And then finally, poor matching between the courses, subjects of the host university and those offered by the home university. And these factors are also considered to be important among staff members. The only real difference between the answer from one students and from, I think that somebody has the microphone opened. Okay, but the most important difference between these two sets of answers is that according to students, complex procedures to apply for mobility is an important barrier, and this was not mentioned by the staff. Whereas the staff insisted in the lack of study programs in English at the partner institutions, and this was not mentioned by students. But the other, factors are very similar. So what we have in our surveys is that we have the possibility to elaborate and to deepen into some of these above mentioned academic and structural barriers to international student mobility. In particular, we can provide through the surveys more information on studies prolongation through a potential poor institutional design, such as a weak incorporation of mobility in the curricula, which is already a barrier in itself. But also we can provide more information on credit recognition between the host and the home universities, okay, which is an issue partially connected to institutional design. Syllabus plus university level regulations, staff approach to mobility, and perhaps how learning agreements are managed at university level. So we have evidence on this area, studies prolongation, okay, through, poor institutional design, and also credit recognition, okay, another important barrier. And I would like just to present some evidence on that. And the first point that I would like to stress is that warning, because when we go in deep and we ask for more precision to respond, and sometimes we obtain answers that qualify these concerns. Okay. For instance, what about studies prolongation, okay, and mobility embedding in the curricula? When we ask to students indicate if mobility is incorporated in the curricula of the study program they are following, most of them don't provide an answer because they don't know. Okay, so, but there is the perception that this is a problem. They don't know where is the perception, but where is the problem exactly, but there is a perception that this could be a problem. In the case of staff members, they know whether mobility is incorporated in the curricula or not. Okay, so from the student's point of view, this is not so clear. And I think that that's important. There is the perception, but they don't know exactly what is happening, at least according to this surveys. Okay. Apart from then, we have that half of the answers in both for students and staff say that yes, that mobility is incorporated in the curricula. Okay, which is quite a lot. So how international mobility is embedded in the curricula? Okay, when this is the case, mobility windows is the most general way in which mobility is embedded in the curricula. Okay, but mandatory mobility is the exception, and this is the result that we obtain when we ask to the staff. Okay, so mobility windows is perceived as for those that know whether or not mobility is embedded in the curriculum, mobility windows is the more usual way, whereas mandatory mobility is rather the exception. Okay. So, in general, what we know is that mobility is not mandatory. Okay, it's not something that students have to follow, and this is quite general when we'll compare at different surveys, either from students and from staff. Okay. Now let's move to another point, which is the role of credit recognition as a potential barrier to international students' mobility. Okay. So this is, of course, an important issue, and this issue needs to be addressed. But if you look at the results that we obtain, when we ask to both students and staff the percentage of credits that students obtain abroad and are recognized when studies return at the home university, there is a percentage of students that they don't know which is the percentage. This could be, and staff goes in the same direction. They don't know when we are asking, okay, so this is a problem, but which is the magnitude of the problem? Some of them are not sure. But for those that provide an answer in terms of the percentage of credits that are recognized, either students or staff, or most of them, provides the following answer, that more than 75% of the credits obtained abroad are, let's say, easily recognized at home. And so certain interpretation of the results might lead to conclude that this might go about nothing. So it's not a so important problem. Okay, so this could be a way to look at this data, but we believe that there is still a certain and probably non-negligible percentage of credits that seems to remain unrecognized. So that means that we have to take into account this issue. When we look at the answers for those that consider that they obtain a very low recognition of their credits at the home university, when we ask for the reasons why the percentage of recognition is low, what we obtain is the answer that syllables in similar courses or subjects are rather different, and this is what staff says. And also, that it's not easy to find matching courses between home and host institutions. So the question of finding similar courses and finding similar curriculum is perceived as an important problem. Okay, and then in the third position, it is also said that academic staff is rather reluctant to accept courses that were taken abroad. Okay, so that's the third most important reason. So we have similarities. So in both students and staff members have a similar approach to the problem of credit recognition, although the order of importance of each of these potential barriers is different. And there is an important point that we like to stress that according to students, one problem in credit recognition is connected to regulations that are too strict, whereas staff doesn't believe that this is a problem, a real problem. Okay, so with the results that we obtain, we can go in deep on the reasons why credit recognition could be a problem. Okay, and then also we obtain information on who is managing the learning agreement, which is essential, of course, in the mobility process. Okay, so and this question was only for staff members, and staff members, most of them knew who were responsible for approving the learning agreement. Okay, and in most cases we obtained that this academic staff who is in charge of the process of recognition. But when we look at who is the responsible of approving learning agreement, we obtain, a diversity of answers. So there are in some universities are professors, lecturers. In other universities is vice deans, or is a vice dean. In other universities, another, different persons. So there is a diversity in managing the learning agreement in terms of the final responsible of signing this important document. And this diversity is also clear when we look at non-academic members, when non-academic members are responsible for approving the learning agreements. And then, of course, the question is whether this diversity in learning agreement management has any impact on credit recognition or not. And this is something that we will have to look more in detail. Okay. And then finally, the last point that I would like to comment on is about the differences on international mobility barriers across study fields. Okay, what we are doing here is to using an output approach. So that means whether mobility rates are higher or lower in the different studies, and from that we assume that higher mobility rates mean lower barriers to mobility and vice versa. Okay, and what we obtain is that similarities across study fields are probably higher than might be thought. Okay, so sometimes we consider that there are enormous diversity among study fields, which is true. Okay, but not so high as perhaps we might consider. In fact, we have evidence on that, and we also have evidence suggesting that in any case, there are some study fields that have more barriers than others as measured by the output approach. And here you have the results. So we have, when we ask to indicate if a certain student has been on mobility abroad or not, what we have, we obtain negative answers, or negative answers are more evident among students in natural sciences, in engineering and architecture, and in health sciences. Okay, so these are the group of fields in which we find lower mobility rates and probably higher academic and institutional barriers, perhaps as we might expect. But look at these graphs. Differences are not enormous among study fields. Okay, so I think that's important to be mentioned. Final remarks. Okay, so we have tried to provide a selection of results organized around key issues. But surveys provide abundant evidence, and therefore we still need to work much more on the information we have. Secondly, in the framework of this project, I think that these results, so preliminary results, the results that we are presenting, suggest that the issue of differences across study fields is justified, and I think that this justifies what is being done in intellectual Opus 3. And also in the framework of the project, the perception that credit recognition or lack of recognition is also connected to shortcomings in finding matching courses or in lack of curriculum homogeneity, which is sometimes connected to information uses, helps to understand the importance of implementing a curricula matching tool, which is, I believe, something we will discuss probably after the break. So that's all. I'm open to any question. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ramon, for your presentation. And indeed, you can see from what Ramon presented what immense material we received. So what diversity of information. And I do appreciate your analysis. It helps a lot to really focus, select some of the core issues, and especially including the staff and student perspective to align the topics that we've been working on. And of course, desk research and surveys were closely interlinked.
All stakeholders. And so when we set about devising this tool, it built upon a great deal of experience that we've had at the UF, because we did in the past have a number of occasions that we did get academics together trying to formulate equivalence maps between different partner institutions. But to make the project automated, a bit more transparent, is a different kind of challenge, one that we are very happy to tackle. So for a short introduction about this tool, our goal is to produce maps of equivalent courses between partner institutions. And this tool would be targeted to the academic coordinators and the staff at the international offices, in general, the people who deal with the learning agreements. These are what we envision would be the primary users of the tool, although we expect that the students will be the primary benefactors at the end result. Right? So the main features that we envision for the tool would give the user the ability to explore the degree programs and the course offerings at a given partner institution, the ability to filter those courses by faculty, by the year inside the curricular plan, even the semester, and of course the academic field, and then to create a list of matching courses both at home and at the partner institution. This would constitute the equivalence map. Now, in this process, it would be very useful for everyone involved that the person taking the lead in trying to create this equivalence map will be able to request feedback from their partners, because you can only go so far in reading certain information from a course catalog and assuming that all of it is available. And we also want to be able to track changes to these equivalence maps for several reasons. of course, there may be some fundamental changes in the courses being offered at home or away, but also for the purpose of institutional memory. So you should be able to survive the change in the staff memory. You should also be able to see all the information and maybe the logic that came to support the particular equivalence map that you produced. So we can have a look at the basic workflow as we envision it. So your user would start by selecting a degree program at their home institution, and from there would focus, for example, on a given year. Let's say that you would focus on the third year of a bachelor's degree or the fifth semester, as the colleague previously mentioned, and then you would go about selecting the closest degree program at your partner institution. So these are the things that will fundamentally underpin each equivalence map. At that point, you can start to pick matching courses. You'll be focusing on the same year because you would assume this would be the same level. If you're only preparing a single semester mobility, you obviously would focus on that semester. But of course, we want to give the ability to expand that search to another year or to another degree program. Say that you're not finding everything that you need because the curricular plans don't really match so closely. Then you should be able to go 1 year up, 1 year down, and search for degree programs, maybe even offered by different faculties at the partner institution. You should be able to request feedback from the partner institution, which in turn means you should also be able to receive feedback requests from your partners when they are trying to match their courses to yours. And we should also consider that whatever map is being built is a work in progress. So we want to keep a change record, give the ability to leave comments and so on. This, we believe, brings not only the information that is fundamental for you to build a learning agreement because you have a tentative map of equivalences for that, but also to explain the logic behind it, which may also help maybe assuage some doubts about the actual content that is offered by the partner institutions and so on, and so maybe mitigate the issue that was discussed earlier about some coordinators not feeling very comfortable in actually recognizing the credits obtained when the student goes on mobility. So this is the general workflow that we are trying to build. Now, of course, we have encountered some challenges. The first of them is, of course, the availability of data and which language that data comes in. There are many different ways to organize this kind of information. We did a ton of research on that. Some institutions already provide it in a digital way, so it can be easily consumed. Some others, it's not so easy to obtain. We have explored the different API specifications out there, so the Erasmus without paper. We've encountered other examples, such as the Open Education API, which is fairly used in the Netherlands. Although these are more focused on communication between systems, like very strong communication, sharing of personal information, so everything is done in a very secure fashion. What we're looking for is a bit more on the side of really open data with actual transparency. So that is one of the challenges that we've been encountering when devising this. And the other one, of course, is usability. Because if you design a tool, you want people to want to use it. But considering the volume of information that comes from this kind of endeavor, it's a bit of a daunting task, if you come to think of it. I mean, imagine a curriculum plan, consider how many courses are in it, consider how many bits of information you want to be in those courses for you to reasonably evaluate whether you can find a match to your course or not, and then try to condense that, not one, but two, side by side on the same screen. So we have been doing a lot of work in terms of usability to make sure that we can condense the information as much as it can be, but not too much. And we're really looking forward to the first testing phase, and looking forward to working with the colleagues for this. What we do find is that this brings us a number of opportunities. So as I mentioned, having open data on course catalogs would be very, very important, we believe. We could, in fact, introduce a systematic approach to curriculum matching. And this would be helpful not just for the purpose of building learning agreements, but also to help underpin the logic of establishing mobility windows, maybe allow institutions to cooperate further, not just in this very specific aspect, where you do want to promote collaboration between partner institutions. After all, your colleagues over the line will be the ones that are most familiar with the actual contents that you're looking for. We feel that promoting this kind of contacts can have network effects that go way beyond the simple purpose of the tool. Ultimately, you can look at increased transparency for staff and students, and we believe that it will be very useful for students to be able to see that there are equivalences out there, that there is an effort made by the staff, by the institutions, to put something more systematic in place. And ultimately, the product that comes from the use of this tool will also allow us to integrate with other digital tools. So, for example, the online learning agreement comes to mind, which is the quintessential case to have matching courses placed side by side. So this, in short, is what we're trying to accomplish with the tool. Fortunately, I don't have anything fancy to show you, because a lot of the work that is going on currently is, of course, on the lower technical level of things. But if you have any questions, I'm available. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thiago, for this overview of the design and the overall idea of the tool. And to be honest, when you mention access to information and usability, diversity of all the data that are maybe even accessible, if at all, of course, I think this is a topic that we are all dealing with, or have been dealing with for many years in the context of learning agreements, and one of the core problems for students as well as staff in preparing mobilities, access to course catalogs, access to course information. So if we find a way, and if this tool triggers actually a change in, let's say, the information culture in this context, this would be indeed removing one of the core barriers. We would allow for a few minutes of questions, and maybe you can, I think, either activate your microphone or enter your questions into the chat. You can ask questions to Thiago, but as well, of course, to Ramon and Jan, or Juan as well, who had the earlier presentations. And maybe I can start the round of questions by exactly addressing you, Jan, and Ramon as well, based on your research, on what you presented earlier, how you would estimate the usability and the relevance of this kind of tool, and how you think it could be actually made useful for students or institutions. Maybe, Jan, because you're already visible, maybe you want to comment?
Thank you, Christina, and thank you to Thiago for this update on the development of the tool. I think it's a very promising tool. Of course, it will be, there are a number of challenges. The language is one issue. If I go through our European University Alliance, for instance, even within that alliance, many course descriptions, once you click onto the pages of the faculty, are in the national language. So that is already a problem in its own. Another problem is staff incentives. As I mentioned, it's not easy to get people to do extra work, and we have a system of correspondence, we call them, in each faculty concerning international relations. But if I would tell them, now, please sit down and find out which are the matching courses, some of them would say spontaneously yes, others would tell me they have too much work to do, and maybe some would say, okay, what am I going to get for this? So this is a problem, but that's an internal problem of each institution, how to motivate their own colleagues. The tool itself is absolutely great, and it would one absolute advantage I can see it would create a kind of objective or objectified tool to establish which courses are actually considered to be equivalent, so that we don't have discussions afterwards with colleagues about whether this class is okay or not, So ideally, in each faculty, a staff member would work on this and set up the list of courses that are considered to be equivalent, Of course, curricula evolve because people come and go, as the English say, there are new staff leaving, people are on maternity leave and what have you. So, this needs to be adapted, but it would provide an absolutely excellent base, and the broader it would be, the better it is. So let us dream a little bit. If, for instance, inside the EUF, a large number of institutions would participate in the effort, would already be absolutely great.
Thank you, Jan. And Ramon?
Yeah, thank you, Tiago, for the presentation. Well, I agree with Jan in the potential shortcomings of this tool, but I would like to emphasize the opportunities of the tool. I think that it provides an answer to one of the main let's say, worries that the students have. So in itself, this is a first step to, to provide a particular solution to this problem. So I think that this should be at least tried. And of course, there is another point, which is the number of universities and institutions that will participate in that. For instance, just to provide a very quick example, the Faculty of Economics and Business have more than 200 partners. And you can imagine that this means an enormous number of different syllabus and programs. How this could be integrated, in which way this could be integrated to become finally useful for students. I'm just providing the example that I better know, but I'm sure that all institutions will face with similar problem. How to reach the possibility to have a really useful tool that could cover all the potential programs in which our students are involved. And I think this is a major challenge, but I think that it should be tried. I believe that this is a good initiative. It should be tried. So that's all. So congratulations again.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I do agree that transition phase is certainly a challenge. I mean, the whole context of digitalization, access to information, the transformation of data so that it can be used in this context or in the different contexts with the different tools is one of the major challenges. And this aspect, Jan, that you mentioned, that this is causing additional work, and this additional workload is usually not in any way, it's not really maybe appreciated, it's not taken into account by leadership, and it's just added onto the responsibilities of many staff members. So it is a problem. It is a problem in the context of the work of the staff involved, and it is a struggle. Just a second, in making it accessible, of course, that will have to be faced. Please, Jan.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. But I think senior leadership could play an important role in this. It's at the same to have a tool like this is an excellent opportunity, honestly, to update your own course catalogs. Because internally we're also faced with the problem of having sometimes very old descriptions of courses. And then as a vice president of international relations, I think I would try to identify ways of encouraging colleagues engage in this process, because it would be an excellent tool to have, and it is likely also to raise mobility flows if students have a clearer picture of what they can expect at the other end. I think it might just make some students decide to actually go on physical mobility, because I understand that there is concern among students that they will be taking classes which are not recognized by their professors. We have had such issues, of course, in the past.
Thank you very much, because I do agree that it can be seen as a chance. Of course, it has to find the support in the institution as well, but we all have to go this way. We have to make the information accessible so students can go abroad. And this finding matching courses is something that has to be done anyway in partnership management as well as on the individual mobility level. So at some point, we have to deal with this information, and of course, they have an accessible, easygoing tool to do it. And once it's working, it can be a tempting motivation maybe to do this extra work in the beginning. And just one last remark from my side. I think it's important to remember that, of course, this tool will not, or the idea is not to remove the individual perspective on the mobility. So it's not to automatize all mobility procedures. It is still, of course, the individual study program of students that will have to be taken into account.
So yes, hi and welcome from my side as well. I'm Carmen, and I'm leading the panel discussion, which is actually along the way already, isn't it? So I wanted to check the chat whether there are still questions coming in for our speakers. So far, there are no questions right now. Just according to the time frame, we have until about 12:30, so we will have a wrap up as well by 12:20. So there's plenty of time also for all the consortium partners to join us for our discussion. And Juan, Jan, Ramon, and Thiago, thank you so much for your presentations. They were so informative and so interesting, especially with regard to the time frame as well. You guys had to speed up your presentation, and we've been working on the project for so many months now without being able to see each other, and this is just another virtual conference again. I wrote down some notes about findings which I found still quite surprising for me, even though I have been dealing with this topic for so long as well. And Juan, I wanted to start with your presentation because I found your idea, or your and your colleagues' ideas, so interesting to go to the schools, to go to the high school and talk about mobility within studies at university, and to just, have best examples, students coming from other countries bringing into the classroom. And this is actually something I haven't thought about at all, to talk about international mobility at high schools already. And I found that quite interesting. And my question would be, did you already manage to try this? And did you visit high schools?
Yes, thanks a lot for the question, Carmen. This is a fascinating topic for me. So ESN has been involved with working with high schools and schools in general, because we also work with elementary schools, for almost 10 years. In 2008, we started in Poland a program called Social Erasmus that had basically, whose aim was to foster volunteering and active citizenship among students. A couple of years later, within this program, we started one of our flagship initiatives, Erasmus in Schools. The idea is super simple. It's very connected to other ideas, like, for instance, DAD does in Germany. I think it's Europe in Schools, but I'm not 100% sure, and many other initiatives that now many people call internalization for higher education for society. So basically, for many years, our volunteers across Europe went to high schools and elementary schools to talk about mobility, to talk about intercultural learning. But till some years ago, we were doing it in not a very coordinated fashion. In 2017, we started our project Social Erasmus Plus. And in that project, we did the whole desk research on how we can better proceed with this initiative, how we can do it in a more structured way, how we can create more impactful activities, more long-term projects that engage the students in a long-term dimension. And from that point onwards, our goal has focused to that, to not only go to the schools every once in a while, but to do it in collaboration with higher education institutions, to do it in collaboration with local municipalities, with regional authorities, to set out clear goals that I want to achieve, clear topics that I want to cover, and if possible, and this is probably the most interesting part for the universities, to kind of reward the students who participate in these activities with ECTS credits. So for instance, imagine that throughout the whole year, an Erasmus student takes part in 20 sessions, total of 30 hours of Erasmus in Schools activities or other volunteering activities that help to promote mobility among local communities. That student will be able to get some credit in the reward that will be recognized in the learning agreement. Therefore, these students will have more time to participate in activities. They will combine them with their formal classes, and we also believe that therefore the learning experience will be more comprehensive, more complete. So this is the current state of affairs. Of course, we had the pandemic right after finishing with our Social Erasmus Plus project. But what do we want to do now, starting from this year, is to increase and upscale our Erasmus in Schools initiatives. Very recently, we signed an agreement, a memorandum of understanding with the Coimbra Group. I think some of your universities are actually part of the Coimbra Group, but you all know the Coimbra Group. And the main aim of this memorandum of understanding is basically this: foster social Erasmus and Erasmus in School activities in collaboration with higher education institutions. So the main takeaway from this is that if you have an ESN section in your university, do not hesitate to reach out to them and to tell them, let's organize Erasmus in Schools together. Let's look for ways to coordinate the initiatives, to benefit from the support that the higher education institution can provide, to benefit from the energy that students can provide, and so on. What we want to achieve is to basically, in all universities in Europe, have similar initiatives that engage students from an early age, so they are all aware of all the benefits that mobility can bring.
Thank you, Juan. And I think it's very, very beneficial to, lure also Erasmus students into going, lure is probably a bit too strong, but to have them engage in this program by also getting credit, right? ECTS. That's always a big issue for students. And especially I'm thinking also about teacher programs. This is a very, very good opportunity for students who want to become teachers to combine the Erasmus experience with the classroom, right? So to get a first-hand feeling of what students nowadays in high schools are thinking about international mobility. And I know that there are some colleagues here from the University of Marburg from the teacher program, which are also currently working on a big project, which was also funded by the DAAD, which has the aim to also get more teachers to do their studies abroad, not only the teachers who are studying English or French, but also teachers of chemistry. So this is a good way, I think, to combine the career aspects of a teacher program with their Erasmus experience. So, and also what you mentioned as well, the issue or the concept of internationalization at home is very, very important here, right? So that you can create a culture of mobility also within your home institution, and also for those students who cannot go abroad. Well, thank you very much. I'm definitely going to take this idea and try to implement it as best as I can, together with all of my colleagues here in Marburg. And what I found very interesting, if I may move on to Jan, that you said, Jan, that you talked about incentives, right, and about funding, because we've learned and we knew before that financial barriers are very, very big problem for students to go abroad, but we should also bear in mind that the career perspectives, pointing out the career perspectives, the beneficials that come along with studying abroad is very important. And you mentioned that. And I think that we still have to work, at least for my university, I can say that we still have to work on within the curricular to point out the benefits for the students' careers after they finish their studies, that being international, going abroad is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And thank you to Juan for this initiative. This is very interesting indeed. We have regular meetings with high schools, of course, to recruit students to our university, but the international dimension of studies is not sufficiently mentioned, I think, during those. And also, it's not easy in France to mobilize alumni, but we're working on this, of course. But one idea we had at Saint-Quentin, Versailles Saint-Quentin, was to actually film students who have been on a mobility experience abroad to talk about a particular destination. Not only about studies, but also student life and the place itself. Especially for destinations. I'll give you one example. I've been going to Vilnius for many years. It's a wonderful city. And Lithuania is a great place to study in, but a lot of students can't imagine very much. They might know that Lithuanians are quite good in basketball, but that's about it, So if you would have somebody talk about the country and the city of Vilnius, and then it might entice other people to actually choose that destination. And in general, of course, it's always good to have success stories. So we're reflecting on communication at our university right now, because usually what happens at the beginning of the first year, you have a kind of large meeting in a lecture hall for new incoming students, for freshmen, as they say in the States, first year students, and they get so much information about the health service and about the cultural activities and where the library is and stuff. So that our impression is that the part on the international office is not really, registered, as it were, by the students. And they tend to say, okay, this is probably in 2 years' time, so it's far away and I'm not so concerned right now. I think we can find ways of getting colleagues to be more involved. And the career aspect is certainly very important aspect that should be enhanced in our communication strategies.
Well, and you said it yourself, Jan. You're usually going abroad once a year by a staff mobility, right? So I think, from my experience, whenever teachers, professors, assistants, whenever they go abroad, they take that experience home to their own institution and pass it along to their students, because usually it's a great experience, right? And you benefit from that experience. And those are the teachers who do encourage their students within the classroom, within the courses, within the lectures to go abroad. And that is very essential for Erasmus, right? That you have staff that encourages students to go abroad, rather than saying, okay, you have to pay attention. As Ramon said, some teachers raise by themselves the issue of credit recognition, right? That it's not only the students who are afraid that their credits are not being recognized. Sometimes the teachers, they're reluctant because it means more work, right? And engagement. Yeah. So it's really, difficult.
It's sometimes also, if I may put it this way, a bit of a lack of imagination. I mean, you just have to make a little extra effort to understand that Shakespeare is taught slightly differently in another country, or if they are not reading a novel by Dickens, it doesn't mean that they're not going to have an interesting experience during their semester in English studies. And the idea is that you go abroad and people do things differently abroad. That's normal, right? But they also do many things in a similar way. So the differences are maybe not so enormous, and that's once again also a communication effort. I think another problem we have is with the ECTS. I'm under the impression that everyone does not calculate them always in the same way, and that so there is a need for more standardization at that level. In theory, we all know what a credit is worth, but in practice, when you look at the workload of courses, there are enormous differences. So that's another thing to work on.
That I do absolutely agree. And if I may say from Marburg's point of view, students and teachers tend to accredit the ECTS not on basis of a module, so they take a whole module, but only specific lectures or specific classes. And that is not the idea of Erasmus, right? That you only take one single class for your credit, but the whole module. And if I want to put it in a very great Shakespearean way, I think much ado about nothing. So credit recognition, is that really the issue? Is that much ado about nothing? Isn't that really something that we are talking about, right? But it's not really the point as such, that it's such a big point. Hermann, if I may, can you elaborate on that? Because you had all the answers from staff and students about credit recognition.
Yeah, it was a little bit provocative but yeah, this is something that surprised us, that we were devoting many time to this issue. And then when you ask whether you remember the problems that you have with credit recognition, I mean, finally, it does not seem, I mean, a crucial, let's say, crucial barrier. I don't know, of course, it's a problem, but I think that the problem is more the difficulties that you have to obtain recognition. So you have to fight. Sometimes you have to fight against, or I don't know, the institution, or against the coordinator or the lecturer, to finally obtain a recognition from who you have been done abroad. And I think finally, perhaps this is recognized, but you have to devote so many energy that, I mean, you remember that as a barrier. Finally, the final result is not so important, but the process is important. And I think that, and this is connected with some of the answers that we obtain, is about paperwork, the kind of, all the bureaucracy that students have to, to deal with in the process of mobility. And perhaps this is more connected with that than with credit recognition itself. So that's my feeling. But of course, it could be a problem. And for certain students, it definitely is a problem. But the evidence that we obtain goes in some different direction. Okay. So that's this our feeling from the results that we're obtaining. Of course, we have to work more in terms of crossing data. That means that to know whether answers are consistent one each other, and this means more econometric techniques and more sophisticated techniques. But that's the feeling I have. I don't know if this is shared by Juan. I liked your presentation, Juan, and I think that our results complement what you have been presenting. I think that's fine and fantastic. But in terms of credit recognition, that's my feeling. I don't know if you agree or not, Carmen, or Juan or Jan, but...
Anyone?
Well, we had I mentioned it in my talk briefly, we have had the case inside the European University Alliance, which is actually very much focused on research, even though it's Erasmus Plus. I'm a little bit surprised, but that's another issue. That one of the partners, I'm not going to say who, refused to recognize automatically the participation of students in some distance learning experiences at another university. And that seems to me completely absurd. If you're inside the European University Alliance, then the issue should not even be raised, So if we have a problem at this level, then you can see what the general situation may be like. And the answers from the survey go to prove this somehow, that the issue is more important than we maybe think. Because you may have the right to go and study. It reminds me a bit of some initiatives we had in France. Like in bachelor studies in France, you are allowed to take at least one course every year in sports, for instance, as an optional course. And when this was introduced, a lot of colleagues in the English department, which I belong to, were shocked and saying, that takes off one Shakespeare class or whatever. And I said, it's not relevant, all right? They're allowed to do this, and that's it. Yeah. And Erasmus Mobility is also, And if it is a right, then maximum flexibility should be expected from colleagues. But in practice, this is far from being the case. So the only solution we found to the problem is to force everyone to establish a study abroad program before they actually leave, to be approved of by the correspondent or coordinator. Of course, the problem is if the coordinator is not particularly flexible, which happens unfortunately sometimes, then it may be a bit tricky for some students to establish a program that is satisfying to them. So, but I think we need to work at this level, that you agree on a program beforehand, and if a class does not work for one reason or another, you need to get feedback from the institution about what other class you should take. And for that, the tool would be extremely useful.
Yeah, in this line, I think that another important point that emerged from the staff survey, and probably Carmen, you will notice when in the interviews, is who is in charge of approving learning agreement and which are the guidelines that those that are responsible of approving learning agreements have. So that's I think important. The diversity is enormous, and sometimes this could introduce, let's say, distortions in the process. And I think this is something that perhaps should be discussed. The necessity to have clear indication from above from everyone. Okay, so that's
absolutely true. Thank you so much for your contributions. Juan, you're moving. Do you want to join, or is there anything that you want to say?
No, I was just thinking about the credit recognition element and how I think it can be especially discouraging for fields that in general have lower participation rates, right? So the more specific the field is, and the let's say the more barriers that the field faces. For instance, you're given the example of law. I remember I am a law alumnus myself, and I was basically the only one going abroad in my year in my university. We have been analyzing a lot health, pharmacy, medical students, and we see the same. That these fears kind of create this culture in which people really hesitate about whether to take the decision or not. So I think it's important. It would be very good for the future to continue researching the motivational factors, right? And how maybe a person who is fully convinced is going to go on mobility, whatever it takes. But for all those students that might be hesitating, that might be doubting, these kind of elements related to recognition can be such a deterrent, and they might feel like, no, I mean, like if I'm not completely sure whether I will get all the credit, I might as well not go because it's not going to be productive for me. Especially when you feel academic pressure. I think for doctors, this can be the case. In most countries, they want to finish as soon as possible so they can take the state exams and so on. So these are things that should be taken into account, especially when we go into specific sectors. Maybe some more open studies like translation or economics struggle less with this because, let's say, they are more open, and the career developments are also less established. But I definitely agree that this is a fundamental factor on for sure. Transparency, even tools like the one Thiago presented before, really useful for this. So this is my take.
Thank you so much. You mentioned the learning agreement. I mean, that is one of the best tools ever of the Erasmus program, right? Because I remember when I went abroad to the States, I didn't get any credit for any of my classes because I went with another program and there was no learning agreement. So I came back and handed in all my classes and grades, and they said, no, sorry, we can't acknowledge any of that. And for that, to end our panel discussion, I'm having a look at the clock as well. I wanted to get back to the tool because the tool would be actually a dream come true, right? So you would just have a system online, and you choose your university where you want to go, and you will get the classes. Also, other students who went there before me, they got credit for, right? So I can ensure that because other students went there before, and teachers also talk with one another to make sure that the credit will be acknowledged, that this tool would be something that is definitely something that will boost student mobility. But I also hear, Thiago, the challenges, regardless of the opportunities, the challenges are quite enormous. thinking also about the different systems the classes are presented, right?
Well, I would definitely agree that the technical challenges are a thing, but this entire discussion brings me back to my student days, because I also went on Erasmus, and I remember that my equivalencies were next to impossible at the time. But at the same time, a colleague who was also for the full year in a different location had pretty much a one-to-one match, so it was fine, which is all fine. And fortunately, my coordinators to work with were extremely flexible, and even though I didn't have that many credits recognized, but once I did, we actually found decent solutions within our curriculum plan for things to make sense. But this is not the case everywhere, and I think people tend to forget that the learning agreement is effectively a contract. Okay, if it's signed, then automatically the recognition should be there. I don't see, to this day, I'm still amazed that this can still become an issue. I mean, you have three parties to a contract that goes back and forth, is reviewed a number of times, and at the end, I still find it hard to believe that people say, yes, I won't recognize it. I won't recognize this thing that you learned because I didn't teach you this thing that you learned. For me, this is mind-boggling, I'd say. But on the other hand, this is also something that I mentioned in terms of the opportunities to start using a tool like this. It's not so much about the tool. It's about establishing lines of communication, establishing trust between partners, right? Because it's perfectly possible that the upper management of your institution is very friendly with the upper management of your partner institution. The same may be true for the international office. The same may be true for some fields. For people involved in certain academic fields and certain faculties, but it might not be true for the others. So at the end of the day, it also highlights the necessity of a different mindset, a different approach. We have to be ready to talk to the partners in the other institutions, like treat them as partners as well. And if this establishes a line of communication, I believe ultimately in an indirect way, it may actually bring more benefits to the students. Ultimately, I think that would be the case, and I hope it is the case.
Tiago, I couldn't end this discussion on a better note, actually, and I jotted down, and I quote you, establishing trust and lines of communication. And actually, that's also what our project norm is all about, right? Establishing trust within the partners, also with the students, and communicate with one another, and having transparency and encouraging students to go abroad and showing them ways to go abroad. And on this, if you guys are okay with it, I will end the panel because it's 12:21. And we are Germans, we like to stick to the schedule.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Carmen, and thanks to all of you in the panel session and your presentations before that. Yeah, indeed. I think most of the aspects that we've been dealing with in the project have been mentioned, discussed, and it was very insightful now for me in this last part, where I could sit back a bit and listen to you instead of looking at the being timekeeper and being like the organizational part in the background, which always hinders a bit really enjoying the contents of the presentations. So it was really helpful for me, and I think I hope for all participants that we've been able to bring across some of the core issues that we've been implementing or discussing in our project. And I think what you, in a kind of summary at the end, Carmen, what you mentioned with the building trust and communication, or what Tiago, of course, included as well, really covers a lot of ground in the context we're working with. And maybe giving this motivation that, Jan, that you mentioned as well, in really getting yourself into the process and getting involved in the process of change as well, for colleagues as well as staff. So one of the outcomes that we, of course, want to achieve in the project is ensuring transparency and equal treatment for students, for participants. I think one aspect that came up in the discussion just now was, for example, and Carmen, you mentioned it with your experience for mobility to the US, some students getting maybe recognition for their study abroad period, others for the same activities in a way not getting recognition, for example, and not having transparency, being dependent on who is your responsible contact person, what documents did you get or didn't get, what is the mood of your professor on the day you are getting to his office. So a lot of issues, or these seemingly tiny issues that students have to deal with once they return from their mobility abroad. So having a learning agreement, having this quality process for the mobility period abroad is, I think, one of the really core quality issues indeed that Erasmus offers. And making it more usable, to make it more reliable, I think is one of the challenges that we've been dealing with for many years. And the tool is indeed a very, very promising, like this light at the horizon, that it might get easier and better and more transparent for students as well. I wanted to get back before we have still 4 minutes left. So one aspect that we mentioned in passing several times, I think, during this meeting, and is the flexibility or the diversity of mobility formats as well. And we had a comment in the chat as well on the issue of traineeships, for example, practical training abroad. And of course, this is something we discussed in the project as well. We're not talking only about study abroad, semester mobilities or 1 year mobilities abroad, but one element that we have to include in the discussion to make mobility more accessible is, of course, including these new mobility formats, including other ways for students to become mobile and to become international. And I think, Juan, you mentioned, for example, in your presentation as well, that maybe short-term mobilities, blended mobilities can be an option, at least a starting point for students to enter international the international experience. So just to mention it in passing, because I think this is something that will feed into our further discussions as well. And these mobilities, of course, have to be recognizable mobilities as well. They have to be linked to ECTS and the recognition process, so students have this added value apart from the international experience. And I have here now, thank you, Franziska, the what happens next slide, just to give you an update. So we heard a lot today about all the data, the research that has been done in the project so far. And this fed, of course, directly into the developing of the tool. Thiago mentioned the tool will be, its focus will be a tool for students to prepare their mobility. But of course, it will be relevant as well for your partnership management. It can be used by staff as well to maybe see a history of mobility, of exchange. So there's a lot of potential here for all the involved parties. What we are doing at the moment in the project is an analysis of selected degree programs, of the curricula, the study regulations, to address the structural barriers that we mentioned during the conference. For example, regulated fields like law or medicine or teacher training, and as well study areas, study fields that are not that mobile, often that is, for example, sciences, to identify in more detail the barriers that exist and the ways we could maybe develop to go around these barriers or remove these barriers rather. Then, of course, you learned about the curricular matching tool, and we will, of course, start, or once it is workable, we will start testing within the consortium as a first step. We will try to implement it to get the access to course details and to see how it works for student and staff, how we can work with it to have successful mobilities. And then, of course, we look forward to opening it up to others for use, for testing, piloting it, so that we can get feedback from you on how useful you find it, how you can integrate it into your processes. And of course, we hope to have further events with you. We hope that we will be able, or we will definitely do workshops and trainings for institutions, for stakeholders, maybe even in present, maybe even real life trainings and workshops and conferences. But at least we will, of course, offer additional virtual events during the course of the project to give you an update of what's happening, to give you access to the tool, the Curricula design guide that I mentioned in the beginning, so you can see how it applies to your institution, how it applies to the demands, the requirements of your institution and your students. This is a bit of an outlook of what will happen, and I think, Carmen, if there's anything I have forgotten, please jump in now.
I'm sitting on my chair. There's nothing to jump because I think you said it all. So I think we are okay so far.
So point blank, 12:30. I think this is an excellent sign. I didn't believe that we would make it in time, actually, and really, my heartfelt thanks to all of you for joining in, for, of course, the speakers, for your really interesting, relevant presentations and the discussion that followed afterwards. It really gave a more diverse perspective on these issues. And of course, thank you all for joining us today, for being part of this event. And we do hope that it has been interesting and helpful. We will make all the information available so you can use it. You can see, maybe identify issues that you find in your institution, maybe discover that there's issues missing that you think maybe we should look into. And we hope to see you again in our next event. And for now, thank you all. Enjoy the rest of the day. And till next time. Bye.